Welcome into the Train with the Best podcast. The podcast is bringing high performance to the people. I'm Craig Hoffman, a media personality and performance coach.
And I'm Chris Gorres, a master trainer and international presenter.
We're going to keep the intro short today because we had a great conversation with Brad Thorpe. He's the founder of Isophit, which he will tell you is a fancy wall. It's a little bit more than a fancy wall. But we really got into the science behind isometrics and why he thinks they are so important and not just undervalued, Chris, but understudied. Some of the things that he's found in his research along the way. Chris and I will then react on the back end to said conversation. But without further ado, here's our chat with Brad Thorpe. And as promised, joining us now, Brad Thorpe. He is the inventor of the Isophit. So we're going to talk a lot about isometrics. We're going to do it all while sitting in place, Chris. Very excited about that. We don't have to pull on anything. We don't have to push anything, but we are not moving as we do this podcast in honor of Brad and what he has invented. Brad, welcome to the Train with the Best podcast.
I appreciate both of your time, and thank you guys for having me on as a guest. And, to your point, all the people listening currently are sitting isometrically. So it's pretty.
But Brad, what if they're listening while they run?
That's true.
The component of change direction, which is often not actually discussed in sport performance, is actually you have to zero out velocity in one direction and reaccelerate in another. So you actually have an isometric component in running. Damn, we own human movement. So
we need to redo the intro then.
Yeah,
introducing the owner of human movement.
There we go. Put that on a business card.
He did it. Yeah.
Well, and that's the beautiful thing about what we do and why people keep calling us. At the end of the day, how do muscles work? You guys are in the industry. You guys are around athletes all the time. There has to be an upregulation of isometric muscle tension before you can generate concentric or eccentric force. That's how muscles work. And we just, as I said, we kind of own that landscape, and we're the ones doing it. And we're so ridiculously fortunate for the people that call us every day that we get to help out. And as I was said right before we got on air, realistically, I created a fancy wall that obstructs movement that is used by the world's strongest, the world's fastest, and the world's most gifted athletes across most sporting spectrums, which is just phenomenal.
It's very, very cool. And so, as opposed to the why'd you invent the fancy wall? Let's attack the origin story this way, Brad. Why did you, or what was the aha moment for you that said isometrics is where we can help athletes be faster, stronger, and also more resilient?
So, realistically, in the world of sport performance, we've always focused on dynamic movement. And that sort of aha moment came actually outside of sport performance and more cardiovascular rehabilitation. So I was struggling with hypertension from the age of 19. I went to school for a program that really focused on cardiovascular rehabilitation and assessment. That's when I was 19 years old. I was diagnosed with hypertension. So my blood pressure was 150 over 100. I was at school on a volleyball scholarship, so a gifted athlete. And then subsequently in my exercise testing protocols with school, I found I had hypertension. So take that, put that over here, jump forward about, let's go with 14 years. So at this point, I've studied under the world's foremost experts in exercise mechanics. You guys would have seen him on as the pitchman for Bowflex, a guy named Tom Purvis. And then I did yeah, exactly. And then I did a certification for muscle activation techniques. And this is a form of manual assessment that allows you to basically determine which muscles are activated or not. And this was a guy named Greg Roscoff. And he was one of the primary reasons after Peyton Manning injured his neck that he went out to Denver to play with the Broncos, subsequently winning a couple, Super Bowls. But prior to that, Greg was working with a guy named John Stockton, who missed 19 games in his entire career. And now his go-to athlete is a guy named Bryson DeChambeau, right, who is now basically the longest hitter on the, now LIV tournament, or Live Tour or PGA Tour. I mean,
Yeah.
longest
hitter in professional golf is probably the easiest
Right.
way to
Yeah.
surmise.
There you go. So I studied under these, world-leading experts in subject area, also having my cardiovascular stuff, but I wasn't able to resolve my blood pressure. So jump forward to 2008, I guess technically would be jumping back now. There was a study from McMaster University, which is a Toronto area sort of university that's really a leading institution for, health research. So they posted or put out a news report that Isometrics was as good as a single pharmaceutical agent for lowering blood pressure in a hypertensive population. And for 14 years, from diagnosis to that moment in time, I was only ever under the understanding that if you had hypertension, high blood pressure, don't do isometrics because it was deemed contraindicated, meaning don't do it because it's actually going to elevate your blood pressure. So with all that knowledge, all that education and all that, and I was the 21st person in the world with my designations at the time, so pretty profound grouping of people, I hadn't been able to resolve my blood pressure issues. After hearing the study, I implemented a 20-minute per day isometric protocol. 2 weeks later, my blood pressure was normalized after 14 years.
The hell?
It flies in the face of all conventional literature because the literature is based off 24 minutes per week. I did 20 minutes per day. So I expedited the process and also the result. And that just put me on this, realistically, this deep dive into isometrics that, well, to be honest, nobody else has been on this journey with me. It's only now recently become popularized. But so put that all in a basket. So I'm using a fancy wall, like literally I'm using a wall for isometric exercises to obstruct movement. Using it for neuromuscular re-education for my athlete clients that I'm using it with. And then one day I had 2 clients walk in one day back to back and said, Brad, there's no wall space at my gym to do isometrics. And I thought, oh, okay. Later that afternoon, I'm like literally sitting naked in the bottom of my bathtub, like sitting with the water sort of showering down on me. And I'm like, holy crap. I know how to create a fancy wall. So I jumped out of my tub, ran to my office, and I have an at-home sort of fitness studio at the time. So I'm like standing in my office, totally naked, and I construct my first ever model of an Isophit. So it was absolutely beautiful, totally worked, and the design hasn't changed much from the original strength trainer. And then we brought out a smaller, more portable unit, which is like the strength kit, which is the one you guys are more familiar with, that we promote more on, social media and stuff like that.
Well, first of all, we thank you for doing this podcast clothed. We very much appreciate it in the video form. That is a ridiculous story. And I can't imagine, like, especially for someone who was as well-researched, as studied, as credentialed as you, to have this thing happen where you yourself are the subject and then go, okay, that's awesome that I've done this, that we've normalized the blood pressure and kind of going back to that moment. But now I got to figure out why, because the why becomes really important. So as you dive into that and have been on this journey, what are some of the key high-level things that we can then dive into, and you and Chris will probably get really nerdy about, but what are some of the really high-level things that you're like, this is why isometrics have this kind of effect on the body that you've been able to uncover as you've researched it over these years?
It's pretty simple. And I know this flies in the face of everybody because everyone says, oh, blood pressure is a difficult thing to deal with. Well, it is if you're looking at one side of it, right? Now, historically, when you're looking at your cardiovascular system, it's broken up into 2 sides. You have your atrial side, which consists of your heart and your arteries and capillaries and stuff like that. And then you have the venous side, like your venous system. So that's your veins. Historically, we look at blood, like obviously blood pressure is important. So for the audience members, so that's the amount, like you have 2 numbers normally, your systolic and diastolic. So the amount of force exerted against your artery wall when your heart is relaxed. And, well, systolic would be when your heart is relaxed. Diastolic is when your heart is contracting. And then that's what we talk about. We talk about like heart rate as well. But one thing we never historically talk about is the simple fact that the atrial side only houses 35% of the blood volume. So if I'm looking at the heart as a pump and I'm trying to fix a circulatory issue, if you wanted to have a direct impact or a more immediate impact, are you going to focus on the 35%? Or maybe if we took the time to focus on the 65%? And we all know, if you're in this game, that venous return is nearly 100% controlled via muscle function. So if I want to create a muscle pump to circulate the blood back to the heart, well, if there was a way that I could activate those muscles to work at a more optimal level, well, maybe I'm going to have a more immediate impact than trying to fix the thing that actually isn't the problem. The problem is poor circulation. The problem is not pressure. So we're going at this thing all wrong in the sense that, well, high blood pressure is a reaction to the problem, which is poor circulation. So if I can increase the circulation by increasing the activation rate of muscle tissues, right? And as we know, there's 640 plus muscles in the human body. Now it gets a little bit more complicated because there's 640-ish muscles, but there's over 4,000 tendons in the human body that work to transmit the force created by the muscle. So if there is a way that I can increase the ability for a muscle to contract and become more effective, transmitting the force from muscle to bone to create movement, well, then I have the perfect solution. And that perfect solution is not dynamic exercise, which is just the compensation patterns of movement. The way I actually increase the activation rate of tissue better, and the studies will indicate this, is isometrics. And isometrics outperforms dynamic exercise. When you're looking at the activation of muscle tissue, right, we have the ability with an isometric to get 100% contraction out of the muscle. With dynamics, it's about 88, 89%. So all of a sudden, we're at either a 12 or an 11% improvement already on hello. And then when you look at it, you go, okay, well, if I can increase the contractility of muscle structure, right? So if I'm looking at my shoulder joint or my glenohumeral joint, and I have an artery and vein sticking through there, if I don't have optimized contractility of structure, well, all of a sudden that arm is going to go under a stretch, right? It's just tissues. So if I stretch a tube, right, just a circular tube, it'll narrow. If I unstretch a tube, the diameter will widen, right? So there's all these hidden benefits to increased contractility. So not only is it going to aid in the return flow, it's going to increase the structural diameter of the artery and veins. It's going to increase the wall thickness so it has more compliance to actually help with circulation. And more so when you're looking at the structure of the venous system, you have all these backflow valves to prevent backflow of blood throughout the structure. So if I put that on stretch, well, those valves don't line up anymore. If I take them off stretch, now they're going to function properly. So we just have a near immediate improvement to the ability to affect circulation. And you won't read this in studies. Now that's about over 100 studies compressed together into, a 6-minute little speech.
So you talk a little bit about like the differences between the muscle contractions of dynamic exercise versus static exercise or isometrics, and I love that. I love how we're able to get more out of the muscle contraction itself. But your fancy wall, as you call it, does more than just give you the ability to fire the muscles. We are firing the muscles at specific angles, right? So can you talk a little bit about how you came up with that and how joint angle specificity when it comes to those muscle contractions, how has that come into your research when you were designing this wall?
Basically, I created the original product was a protractor. So I just wanted to obstruct to be honest, it doesn't get much simpler than that.
I think we should say, for any listener that hasn't seen the Isophit, it is like a platform, and then there is
like a protractor.
The protractor is actually the easiest analogy, but like there's kind of like a rod system. I don't know the better way to say it, but like you're pulling on a piece of metal and you're standing on another thing, and that's it. That's the thing. But if you can move that angle, then you get your fancy protractor / fancy wall.
Yeah, so we basically have the ability to restrain all human joint motion at every muscle length, at every joint position, for every potential movement. So when people sort of say, hey, my exercise product does, 9 different movement patterns, I'm comfortable to say, well, we restrain all movement, so we do trillions of things. You just have to understand how to work through that. But to your point, Chris, when you're looking at a joint-specific isometric, you also have to take into consideration you're applying force to the entire body the entire time, right? So even though let's say you're doing a mid-thigh pull, you're doing stuff for your ankle, stuff for your knee, stuff for your spinal position, like all those individual vertebrae that make up your spine. You're doing some stuff for your grip strength, obviously, and your shoulder. So the majority of isometrics, when using Isophit, are whole body muscle contractions, and all you're doing is configuring your orientation. So if you want to look like you're doing a leg press, well, that's one way to do it. If you want to look like you're doing a deadlift at various positions, and every degree that you changes 100% of the scenario you're dealing with. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, I'm doing a deadlift, right? So if I started at a mid shin, went to a knee, went to a mid-thigh, then went to lockout. So to me, that's 4 distinct exercises. To a traditional deadlifter, they're going to say, well, that is one exercise. Now, the problem with that is you only have the ability in a dynamic world to really sort of maximize strength in a given range, and then the load is changing throughout that range. Where in an isometric, I have the ability to maximize load out or force output, or I can, put in a submaximal effort at any point in time. And so I'm going to make the athlete stronger. I'm going to target more tissues specifically, and I'm going to do it all safer while generating higher levels of force. And if you want to be good at deadlift specifically, then go practice the deadlift. If you want to be a sprinter, then go sprint. If you're a basketball athlete, go jump, go shoot, go practice the skill you want to be good at. Now, I'll kind of offend a fair bit of your audience right now. So if you're an S&C coach out there, if your goal is to be good at gym exercises, it's important to do gym exercises. If your goal is to be good at the sport that you're trying to be good at, some of those exercises are not even warranted. And you might want to look at them differently from this point on. And how do you maximize the strength, the stability, the force and power generation of that athlete so they optimize their sport performance, not their gym performance?
Sure.
So.
And I love you said that because, obviously as somebody who trains athletes, our job is to get them better at their sport, not to get them better here in that weight room. Right. But there are things that we explore in the weight room, like what is the best bang for our buck? What is the thing that's going to get us the most benefit while risking the least? And I've always loved isometrics because of the fact that if we're not moving, we aren't creating that shear force on a joint that could be potentially dangerous while still getting the muscle activation that you're talking about. In your research, what have you seen as a couple of things? You kind of touched on it. What are the limiting factors, right? Because if we're going to be able to produce a ton of force, there's going to be something that limits the factor, right? Like if you're holding on to something like a bar, grip strength is going to be a limiting factor. Some people, for instance, female soccer players, are not going to have the grip strength to be able to match what their legs can do. How do you get around that with the Isophit? And then what are your best bang for your buck exercises, do you think?
So limiting factors such as grip strength, you could change the exercise, right? Like you don't have to do a mid-thigh pull where you're, using your grip. You can do a Zercher squat, a Zercher lunge. You can manipulate, you can do a leg press, because if the goal is to stimulate the tissues, well, stimulate the tissues, right? So that, it actually is that simple. Or put on, lifting straps. So there's, a multitude of those so you can offset load. Also with Isophit, and when you're looking at pulling into something that doesn't move, a crossbar, you can manipulate where that point of application is. So if I actually want to, change the orientation where dumbbells don't offer that solution, bands traditionally, if you're holding it with your hands, don't offer that solution. So that becomes healthier. But to your point, or your question, what are the biggest bangs for the buck exercise? It really depends on the sport, the history of the athlete, like what's their injury history, use, and all that sort of stuff. But one thing that I'm comfortable to guarantee, if you listen to my advice and you take a whole body isometric training approach, you will have the ability to increase their performance within a week. Not 6 months, not a year. You'll start to notice a bold difference. Because what happens with isometrics that doesn't happen in dynamic exercise to the same level of efficiency? Well, if I can increase the activation rate of muscle tissue closer to 100%, and I take the time to increase, let's stay away from 3 to 5 second high intensity, maximum exertion isometrics, right? If you're not prepared for them, they will injure you or put you at risk of injury. I am a heavy proponent of 45-second muscle contraction lengths, right? The reason for that is it's going to increase tendon stiffness and strength, right? And there's over 4,000 tendons in the human body that need to be stronger and more resilient to transfer force. It's also going to increase the enthus, which is a component of structure that goes from the tendon to the bone. It's also going to increase bone stiffness, which is going to help further stability throughout structure. And one thing that's never talked about in youth athletics is the fact that kids have 300 bones, adults have 206. So that's always forgotten about in the conversation, right? So we're looking at how do we create stability in kids when we're saying, oh, keep moving more. So put that over there. But what we have to look at is, well, if I can increase the stiffness and compliance of the tendon structure, and now I can maximize activation and force output, now it's just a velocity game. Practice the skill you want to be good at game speed, or sport speed, let's go with, if you're not a game scenario.
Sure. Okay. God, I have so many questions.
I have so many right now. I'm letting you jump in here, Craig.
So let me double click on something you just said before we lose this train of thought. When it comes to the actual programming, whether it's on an Isophit or if you have your own wall at home, you say a 45-second isometric versus 3 to 5 second, like let me have the veins popping out of my head type of isometrics. What? Like, is that one set? Is that multiple sets? Like, what does the programming for what you think is optimal look like?
So my opinion, I would look at, and we structured a program around this, so it's 30 isometrics in 30 minutes. Right, so it's a complete routine where you're looking at 10 exercises for your upper body, 10 for your core, 10 for your lower body. And what that's going to help the athlete do, or the trainer or coach, is take the guesswork out of the scenario. So we've already structured that routine where, let's say your lower body would start with a leg press, then you would go to a Zercher squat, then you would do about 6 minutes of hip abduction while standing, neutral, internal, external rotation, both sides, then do a deadlift, and then do what we call a horizontal calf raise, which is where you put the balls of your feet on a crossbar and you full plantar flexion, and then you try to lift your butt and your spinal, basically a spinal extension, arm extension, capital extension. So if you're looking at posterior chain stuff, it's the best posterior chain exercise you can do, right? Because a lot of stuff when we're looking at movement patterns, or let's say lower body calf raises and stuff like that, we discount the fact that when we do a calf raise, we jam the hell out of our great toe. And if we're pushing on our great toe, we got our flexor hallucis longus tendon that comes underneath. And if we're putting 4 or 5 times body weight into a tendon structure, well, maybe that's stretching that tendon structure. If I stretch a tendon, well, my force generating capability just reduced. If my force generating capability just reduced, well, now if I'm looking at the art of plantar flexion, maybe I'm now dumping more load into my Achilles tendon, which keeps rupturing in NFL football players. So if you want to understand how to resolve that, maybe stop doing soleus training the way you're currently doing it. That's to your audience out there who wants to resolve, this ungodly amount of ACL ruptures that we're seeing these days. So that's one thing. But when you're looking at 3 to 5 seconds. So Eddie Hall, the first guy to ever deadlift 500 kilos, so half a ton. So he did a mid-thigh. That's only 1,103 pounds.
Only.
So only. So
Sorry for my reaction.
But here's the thing. That's chump change, right? Because when Eddie did, and I saw this on social, so I'll take it for what it is. It was on social media. He did a mid-thigh pull test, and he generated 1,700 pounds.
Yeah.
So if you want to be strong and you're training with 1,100 pounds, don't get me wrong, that's huge. But if you can train with 1,700 pounds, holy shit. Sorry to swear on your podcast, but you're going to be wicked.
Not the first swear on this podcast. Don't worry about it.
So you guys aren't like the F1 community over there, where they get all upset and fine people.
That is not us. So I love that you brought that up because an 1,100 pound deadlift is like you said, and you've touched on this throughout the course of this conversation. 1,100 pounds is not 1,100 pounds throughout that full range of motion, right? And you get to that point, that joint angle that we talked about earlier. There is going to be an optimal joint angle where you're going to be able to produce a ton of force, and that's probably not going to be when that bar is on the floor. And that's why I love being able to manipulate the different joint angles and create as much force as we possibly can for all the things that you just talked about. I want to kind of get into some of the things that you a little bit touched on with in regards to ACL ruptures and Achilles ruptures and things like that. So when we are on the other side of that, that's already happened, and we've got clients and patients who are coming back from that. How is it beneficial in the research that you've done? Why are isometrics better than traditional dynamic exercises and rehabbing a patient?
So imagine you're trying to have a conversation with a person and they keep rotating their head left and right. It's really annoying. So the level of specificity to dynamic exercise is nearly zero, right? You keep moving the joint position. So that means that all the other muscles that are going to stabilize and support that joint position are no longer doing the same workload, right? So if I'm manipulating things like orientation, there's a thing that you really need to pay attention to when looking at how do you calculate force is what's called a moment arm. And that's basically the perpendicular line between the line of force and the joint axis. So if I'm manipulating that, so I'm consistently changing the load. So those are variables that are often not discussed. But there's also going to be different segments of a specific muscle. If I change the orientation, that muscle is no longer working at an optimal, it's no longer at an optimal length. Other muscles are now participating, right? So it's more of a compensatory movement sequence as you go through a range, right? So if I'm doing, a hamstring curl, right? Because we were talking about ACLs. So here's the problem. I've already set you on a path of self-destruction because I told you what we were doing was a hamstring curl. The problem with that is, well, what about a muscle called your popliteus, your gastroc, your plantaris, your sartorius, your gracilis, right? Those are the other muscles that flex your knee that weren't even part of the conversation. So if they're not part of the conversation, and I'm doing let's say I'm doing a Nordic hamstring curl, Nordic hamstring test, if you're dealing with the sports science community, right? So if I'm looking at it, and let's say I have a machine that tests force output.
Let's call it the Nord board. Let's just use it because people know the Nord board from Vald, which has become one of the gold standards or the so-called gold standards when it comes to rehab. Let's talk about that.
Cool. So I won't use their name, but but you can look at a product like that. So companies such as them tell you that they have the ability to produce and show you asymmetries in force output. That's absolutely categorically 100% absolute fucking bullshit. And that is the root cause, in my opinion, why injuries are happening at such high rates. Reason for it. If you have 10 muscles contributing to 100 pounds on your left side and your right side, there is virtually zero ability to have equalized force output on both sides, especially if I'm dealing with a post-ACL rupture, right? So even though the number could say the same, I could be looking at 100 and 100, right? Left side, right side, both equal 100. There's not a chance that those numbers are symmetrical, right? It's something like the odds. It would take a supercomputer decades to look at all the different variables to say that that is actually structurally sound, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one of the issues. A different issue, are the bone densities the same on the left side and the right side? The answer is probably not. It takes about 24 months for the bone density to actually strengthen up to pre-injury rates when we're looking at specific to ACL injuries, right? So when you're using data to make choices, and that data may be misinforming you, you may see decisions that lead to higher rates of injury. So since 2015, you can look at the rate of ACL injuries. You can look at the rate of hamstring injuries specific to the UEFA, so the European Soccer Federation. They have increased. Why have they increased with the increase in data monitoring? So I hope I navigated that well. But those are some serious things you have to look at. So why are these kids getting injured? Well, if I'm telling you that your hamstring is a specific strength, and there's fMRI studies that will show you that the lead muscle involved in a Nordic hamstring test is your gracilis. So it's like, oh, but I didn't know that was even involved in the test. But your gracilis connects with your semitendinosus, which connects to your sartorius, right? So they're a common tendon for these muscles, right? So we got to understand structural anatomy. We got to understand force application. And then what was the goal of the athlete? Now, if my gracilis is the lead muscle in a Nordic hamstring curl, according to fMRI studies, well, if the root cause or the most susceptible area for a ACL rupture is slight flexion and internal rotation on impact, and my leg is floating through space in an open chain scenario before it contacts the ground, and I got a strength imbalance where let's say my gracilis is generating a little bit more force, and I land in a slightly flexed and internally rotated position, well, that may be a risk factor to blowing out my ACL. Now, recognizing that event occurred because there was an instantaneous failure of the ability to upregulate isometric muscle tension, so I couldn't generate muscle tension at that moment of impact, and then I'm going to have that shear force you mentioned earlier, that translatory force going across structure, and that's how I'm going to end up blowing out my knee, right? And that happens at a rate that if I compress time, I can look at it and go, well, that's like film. If I expand time, that's like hitting pause on a motion picture, right? I can look at a still image for decades, millennial, really. So having sort of and looking at all of this sort of stuff, we just got to be open to it. Let's have an open conversation. Then we have to also understand the forces of running, right? So we always see that somebody's running through space, but we don't think that there's rotational forces, and there's also translatory forces. So if you got your foot fixed on the ground, so the net velocity of that foot on the ground is 0, and instantaneous net velocity of 0. And the magnitude of the upper torso or the upper body mass is actually twice the magnitude. So we have to understand that if I'm running, cutting, and pivoting, the forces don't care your time interval. They care of the forces that you're dealing with. And do I understand all those 10 muscles that stabilize the knee structure on the posterior side? What are the ones on the front side, the anterior side? And one of the other things that we have to think about, if we jump back to that seated calf thing, where I was saying we screw up the toe, if you're doing an isometric seated calf raise, where you're not just doing it like a HEMA where it's holding isometric, but you're pushing into it like an immovable bar, just run away from that isometric altogether. Because there's this tissue there, you're pulling into your patella tendon, right? So do you really want to sort of lengthen and stretch that? There's a muscle called your articularis genu, you never thought of. And then the condyles of the femur aren't equal on both sides. So do I want to be jamming them home on one side and not the other? So there's all these different things from a force perspective. So what you'll start seeing is lateral meniscal tears increasing, and that can be associated with seated isometrics or seated calf raise isometrics in a restrained environment. So there's my little rant. Sorry about that.
I guess we'll wrap here, Brad. you mentioned a couple of times, like, if you want to be good at the sport, you got to practice the sport, right? Like, ultimately, you can't just do isometrics if you want to be an athlete that moves. You need to eventually figure out how it is you're going to apply all these forces and get good at that thing too. So along those lines, when we think about programming and we think about kind of the complete picture of what an athlete does, where does Isophit and where do isometrics fit in a holistic program? Can it be the entirety, in your opinion, of strength and conditioning, or the strength side at least, or is it the biggest part? Like, how does it fit into the full picture of an athlete's training?
If I had 100% control with athlete, I would manipulate the time intervals of isometrics. So I would look at a 45-second hold. I would look at, once we built the establishment of tendon stiffness, bone strength, muscle strength, neurological adaptation to all those tissues, I would then look at the frequency rate of the time interval. I would compress that down and sort of say, where I said 3 to 5 seconds, don't start there, right, because it could injure somebody. That doesn't mean that once you're prepared for it, don't go there. Right. Then you could also look at basically explosive isometrics, where you're looking at micro contractions, where you're looking at high forces for, less than, half a second, where it's like, let's look at development of rate of force development, which, by the way, is an isometric measure of force output. Right. We forget that because it sounds like it's moving. It's actually a measure of isometrics. Then we subsequently move on from there. So, but one thing that we have to look at is rate of fatigue, right? That's something that's not often talked about, right? Now coming into the sports world, we're now talking about braking force quite commonly. It's now becoming normalized, where we're looking at deceleration efforts. But we have to take it one step further. What is the goal of deceleration for change of direction? The goal is to be able to do an isometric and stop, and then accelerate out of that. So we have to remember that. And when we're looking at an eccentric contraction, obviously, historically, they will say there's a breaking of the muscle fibers. And then now we throw in that thing called Titan, right? So it's like throwing out an anchor and sort of, getting that sort of braking force as well. But it just comes back to, if we add that isometric component, we can bookshelf the dynamic world for the non-believers, where until they start believing and start adapting and seeing, well, they're going to say, well, you have to move, you have to move, you have to move, you have to move, you have to move. The answer is, look at the injury rates. It's not working. So let's explore that further. So if I bookshelf your training session and said, I'm going to start with isometrics, and then I'm going to finish with isometrics because I got to restore that trauma to structure, and then practice the skill of your activity, right? That's what's going to lead to better championships or better athletes who are more available, more durable, because I'm going to make you actually stronger, way stronger than you ever will in a dynamic environment. It's not even comparable. When you're looking at isometric force output and isometric strength adaptation-wise, you could do a multi-week dynamic training protocol and have almost zero increase in isometric force output. Inverse that, do an isometric protocol, you will have a 200% increase in your, basically relative to dynamic strength, isometric strength, and also you'll also have the improvement. If you do multiple isometrics throughout a range, you'll also increase the dynamic capability and dynamic strength. So it's like you get the better bang for your buck doing this, but you have to practice the skill. Right? So whatever that is, if it's running and jumping or shooting or, serving if you're tennis or volleyball or whatever it happens to be. So, but, that is not the conventional wisdom, but we just have to, we have to keep exploring this a whole lot further than what we've been doing. So
definitely sounds like something that needs to be explored and researched more. And, really appreciate your time talking about it today here on the podcast. If you want to check out more from Isophit, it's Isophit. Check them out on Instagram, Google it, and go to their website, the whole deal. And obviously you can check out Brad's fancy wall there and perhaps get one for yourself. Brad, appreciate the time. Thanks so much for joining us on the Train with the Best podcast.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks again to Brad for joining us. Chris, that was a fascinating conversation.
That was a lot. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think the fact that it starts, it's so funny. This happened, Jason Wersland, right? It starts
Yep.
Theragun, Therabody, the whole enterprise that he's built starts
Compression
with
boots,
I am,
same thing.
Yeah, I
Yep.
am trying to get myself out of pain. Brad was trying to solve a problem with his blood pressure. He wasn't actually even trying. He just not only stumbled bass backwards into it, but he kind of did on some level, like stumble into this solution, figures out why this is happening, and it's like, oh, well, I have something that can help me and then help others, and then that launches a whole path. I think the most fascinating part, though, is like we often try to push people on the pod, like it sounds too good to be true, and there's a lot of, I think, in that conversation, things that sound too good to be true until you, I think, take a little next level thought of it. Chris, some of those like instantaneous reaction things, do you buy, I don't say what he's selling, but for lack of a better phrase, like what he's selling?
I actually do. There's a lot about the isometric contractions that are just beneficial that you don't get in a typical dynamic effort, right? And I should clarify, because we didn't really get to do this in the course of the conversation, that the specific type of isometrics that he's talking about with the Isophit are overcoming isometrics, not the yielding isometrics that we might do when we were like holding a squat or holding a wall sit or something like that, right? Like what we're trying to do is move an immovable object, and the Isophit is a contraption that allows you to create whatever setup that you need to move against an immovable object, right? Or an immovable fancy wall, as he puts it, right? And
Right.
when you're doing that, what you're doing is you're really unlocking effort levels, right? Like you're unlocking pathways in your brain that are telling muscles to fire. And when you get your muscles to fire, all of those tendons that are connected to that muscle are now also activated and engaged, where you might not get that when you're moving a weight. Because when you're moving a weight, just like pushing a car, when did you actually start to move that car, right? And then at some point that car is moving on its own. So, you know, when you talk about isometrics and like the way that you can build muscles and build muscle activation, there's absolutely so much truth to not just the physiological benefits, but the neurological benefits that you can unlock immediately, because we know neurological adaptations can happen a lot faster than hypertrophy per se.
Right. The thing is, though, like neurological adaptations are temporary to an extent. There are obviously over time, like if you continue to do it, you
Sure.
strengthen those neurological pathways. But the instantaneous, like when he says, "Oh, we saw an instant, rate of force increase, and we saw an increase in performance instantly based off 1, 2, 3 sessions," that's not happening because there's tissue adaptation. Which is something that Brad would tell you. We just didn't get to talk about that on the show. I know that he would tell you that because we asked him in our brief chat with him after we got done recording, and he confirmed, like, yes, absolutely. That's what we're talking about here. But over time, those neurological things do start to stick, and you do get the tissue adaptations. I guess the thing that I would be curious of to talk to him more about is, like, when we talk about the sustainable stuff over time, how much different are the tissue adaptations from isometrics versus dynamic movement? Obviously, like, I do think it's hard to swallow the idea that, like, if you want to get better at moving, this is the way. But that's where I think the balance of like the skill and practicing the specific skill versus, hey, this trait of force generation needs to improve. And that battle, I think, with like strength and conditioning versus sport is a tale as old as time.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to what he's saying. Like, so there's a lot of measurables, and then there are a lot of things that you can't measure in sports, right? So typically when we talk about measurables, the hard part about measurables is if you're measuring the efficacy of a particular protocol, whether it be dynamic exercise, high speed exercise, RFD, whatever, all you're doing is measuring that with other measurables. Right. So it's hard to say that, like, this is going to help you improve your sport. No, this is going to help you improve the other measurable sports, like sprint speed, jump height, all that other stuff. And that's great. We know those things are important. But, like, is this going to help you guard LeBron?
Right.
How do we measure that? Right. Like if you're Terry McLaurin, is this going to help you create separation? Like, there's so many
Sprint
different
speed
things.
can help with that, but there's also what
but there's
decision
so
making,
much
your
more.
route of when you actually burst, when you separate, your
Right.
release technique. Like, there's a lot of
Right.
things that go into that. And even on the like oh, well, the way you would measure guarding LeBron is how many points does he score against you? But like that's part of a team defensive dynamic.
Exactly.
It's part of 10 moving bodies on the floor. There's a schematic element of how you are being deployed defensively and what they're doing offensively. Like there's an endless string of factors that impact that data and that number that is ultimately the measurable of how many points did LeBron James put on my head tonight.
Right. And that's what I mean. Just the principle of like, how do we measure something's efficacy? Well, we measure something's efficacy with things that are measurable. We can't measure its efficacy against things that are not measurable, right? So that's just always going to be there. That's always something that you just kind of have to recognize. Now, what I would say is when it comes to the isometric stuff, when it comes to those neurological adaptations is, like your brain does have memory, or your nerves do have memory, your muscles do have memory, not to confuse them with P90X style workouts, but like if you have been here before and your brain knows how to do that, or if you were injured and your brain has reset those neurological pathways and you no longer know how to fire a glute or fire your hamstring or squat perfectly or whatever it is, right? Like to be able to create those environments where we open up those neurological pathways, that is so beneficial. And maybe we can measure it, maybe we can't. But like just for me, knowing and watching people squat or move and watching their anxiety in that movement versus their confidence in that movement, like anxiety confidence level has so much more to do with the power output than the physiological part of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. The other thing that I liked that we talked about at the end was like the fatigue level. And actually, I don't even know if that was in our recorded conversation now that everything mushed together. I've been sitting, Chris, this is like the 18th thing I've done in front of this microphone. And I have a 3-hour radio show that starts in an hour.
That's what happens when the Commanders are good, buddy.
Yeah, man. People want to talk. People want to talk. And we're in, the NWSL playoff stretch, the WNBA playoffs. So I got shows on all that stuff. There's a lot happening. But the fatigue level of like, can you maintain an isometric and at what level, what intensity? And, I definitely was someone who I think when I used isometrics was a lot more in the, like, let's do the 3 to 5 seconds. Like, let's try to, simulate explosiveness and maximal neural drive and muscle development. And the idea of using them from a fatigue standpoint and like 45-second isometrics and things like that, I think is something that I want to start playing with, especially since I'm doing more endurance stuff myself right now. Yes, Rachel, I will run more. My run coach wife. But I also think that when I think about ways that I can support that is something that I definitely want to play with, and that's got my brain circling and something that I will circle back with him, with Brad on next time we have him on the show. Thanks again to Brad Thorpe for joining us. If you want more from Chris on Instagram at Trainer Gorres, I'm at Craig_Hoffman. And we appreciate everyone checking us out. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with Steve Webster from Asensei. Looking forward to that conversation and whatever else we think of between now and then. So make sure you subscribe. Stay tuned here to the Train with the Best podcast, and we will see you then.